The artifacts that I chose from the Historical Society were a Braille typewriter used for letters or other forms of personal communications, and then a couple of beaded crafts, a pitcher and a basket. 2 pictures came with the artifacts. The one on the left is of Thomas Lohr. He lost his sight at a very young age, and then it was just labeled on the picture that he attended a school for the blind in Philadelphia. And then the picture on the right is of his sister Catherine Lohr. It didn't really have any other information on the family, so I had to really dig into the artifacts and research the family a little bit. Thomas was originally the focus of my project, but as I researched, I began to learn more actually about his younger sister, Catherine. I got in touch with the family, and her family remembers her as a remarkable woman, just very intelligent. When I asked about the Braille typewriter, her grandson actually told me that she bought her brother the typewriter, and then she actually learned Braille herself so that she could communicate with him while he was away. Along with the typewriter, the collection featured 2 small beaded crafts that Thomas made while he was at school in Philadelphia. When I started researching the school, I found that in the 1890s, this would have been the closest school for the blind that Thomas could have attended. It was all the way across the state in Philadelphia. This really set up my research question. What would life have been like for the visually impaired in the late 1800s, especially in a more rural area like Indiana, Pennsylvania? As I started to research it more, I found a lot of statistics from the 1890 census specifically related to the blind and visually impaired. In 1890, there were 50,411 blind people in the United States. 3,925 of those were from Pennsylvania, and then 33 of them were from Indiana County. Throughout the 1800s, there was a big change in how society viewed and treated those with visual impairment. Before the 1830s, the blind were normally kept at home for basically their entire lives. They were kept in the care of their parents or maybe their siblings after their parents passed away, and if that wasn't an option, they might be institutionalized because living by themselves just was traditionally not an option. There really wasn't any special instruction for blind children either. Schools traditionally didn't really offer adaptations to suit the needs of children with visual impairment, and they really weren't given a proper education like their peers did. In fact, it was commonly thought that blind children were somehow more fragile than children with sight, so they didn't necessarily receive a good education or just as much activity as other children did. Throughout the 1830s, though, some people really started to take an interest in educating the blind using special instruction and tools like Braille. This was including the school in Philadelphia that was established in 1833, and it actually still stands today. It has changed names and locations. It's now called the Overbrook School for the Blind, but it is the same school that Thomas would have attended in the 1890s. He actually attended the school from about 1889 to 1896, from about the ages of 15 to 22. Just as a fun side note, I found a Philadelphia Times article from 1890 discussing the school's food. Thomas is actually quoted in the article. He had a lot nicer comments about the food than several of his peers did. He's quoted here as saying that the food is fine, but the meat is a little bit tough. It's safe to say that the school may not have been a culinary marvel by any stretch, but it really was pretty miraculous in the treatment that it gave those with visual impairment. Special education for the blind was pretty much unheard of in the United States at this time, so those who founded and led the school really had the intention of preparing the students to hold a career and be self-sufficient. In doing so, they also wanted to really dispel some widespread myths about people with visual impairment. One was that a person with visual impairment was just incapable of being educated or holding a job. Of course, this was not true. The second myth that was particularly harmful to those with visual impairment was that they were actually just lazy, that they didn't want to hold a job or get a good education. Of course, again, this was not true, this was never true, but it was pretty widespread throughout society, and it was really detrimental to those with visual impairment. In order to combat that, the schools for the blind gave their students good educations and adapted to meet the needs of their students, placing a special focus on activity and keeping their students healthy. One report from the Philadelphia institution demonstrates this, with the president of the board of managers saying, "A visitor of the school today watching the wonderful agility of the students would find it hard to believe that they were without sight." In the same report, it stated that the goal of the organization was to have each pupil employed as gainfully as possible, considering his capabilities immediately after leaving school. The report also goes on to list recent graduates who continued and excelled in higher education, as well as students who were gainfully employed and receiving increased compensation in their first few years of work. As for Thomas Lohr, the focus of my research, little is known about what he did after graduation. One Indiana Gazette article provides his plans to study for the ministry after he graduates, but it's unknown if he actually followed through on those plans. I do know about the rest of his life that he lived to the age of 40, dying in 1915. He he is buried in a cemetery in nearby Armstrong County. Much more is known about Catherine Lohr thanks to her descendants who were willing to share their family history with me. Her grandson told me about her life, telling me that she married Daniel Rankin and she lived in Indiana for the remainder of her life. She passed away in 1961. She is very fondly remembered by her family. Her grandson told me about some of her quirks, saying that she had an affinity for snakes. He told me that there was a family legend that she kept a rattlesnake in a box in her car to keep any potential car thieves away. He doubts the truth to this rumor, but he does say it really represented how he remembers his grandmother. Like I said, this rumor may not be true, but he also sent me a picture of her holding a rattlesnake and said that she was pretty fearless. Thomas and Kate are more than just a touching family story in Indiana County. They really do represent a much broader story of the 50,000 people with visual impairment in the United States. In 1890, Thomas was one of the 4,000 people in Pennsylvania that only had one resource available to them in terms of education. He had to travel all the way across the state to go to this school. In terms of artifacts, the typewriter provided by Catherine shows the improving technology that helped people with visual impairment to adapt to life in a world where you traditionally needed sight. The other artifact, the beaded crafts, really showcases the education that Thomas received while he was away at the School for the Blind. These institutions taught, and like I said, Overbrook still exists. It continues to teach the visually impaired by adapting to their needs and allowing them to thrive in a world that really had not let them before. Students like Thomas learn tactile skills, creating intricate designs like these beaded crafts, and receiving an education that could carry him into the workforce or into higher educations, options that had traditionally been very inaccessible to people with visual impairment. I really couldn't end the podcast without a big thank you to John Franklin Kerr and Candace Bracey, who shared the Lohr family history with me and also several of the photographs throughout this podcast. I wouldn't have had a place to start my research without them, so I'm very thankful. Our other Historical Society artifacts and digital history projects are available on the Indiana County History and Memory website.